Okay, before we get started today, I've got to do one thing that I've been remiss in doing, and that is giving a shout out to Dan. He is the latest $6 subscriber on the How to Be an Artist Patreon page. So Dan, I want to say thank you for supporting the podcast. This is your shout out. Thank you. If you would like to get a shout out just like Dan got, you can become a Patreon for How to Be an Artist as well. To do that, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA. I also want to give a little bit of an intro to this episode today. So, this episode is another one of those episodes where I'm going to veer off a bit from what is an obvious topic as related to art. And I thought that now would be as good of a time as any to explain a little bit about the concept of community as it relates to the making of art. And this is one of these topics that I'm going to keep returning to, so it's probably a good time to kind of frame it so you guys can get a sense of where I'm coming from when I talk about community. If you want to get just like a hint of where I'm going with this, you can always check out my YouTube video. It's called Stop Networking and Start Building Community. But this is a concept I've been thinking a lot about. Our modern society has seen a deterioration of community in a lot of really important ways. And I think it's important to see clearly and investigate what we might be missing and hopefully we can start rebuilding in some way. I think it's particularly relevant to artists as well. So I should probably just explain why that is, why I believe that is. I think community is important because community determines reality. There's this magic thing that happens. As soon as you get two people together that agree on some idea, it takes on a new quality. It no longer just becomes an idea. It starts to feel real to us. As real as any other solid object that we might bump into in the real world. And we can see what happens when suddenly you have, hundreds or thousands or millions of people sharing an idea. People will die for those shared ideas. You think about what money is. Money is really, it's just a shared idea, or what a nation is, or what laws are. So community really matters. It shapes our reality. And the world we currently live in has certain ideas that shape how we view reality that can be kind of tough if you're an artist. One of these ideas is that your worth is based on some sort of financial status or the possession of stuff. And for anyone that values making art, this is a problem because art by its very nature is a risky financial endeavor. It's something that doesn't have like a linear payoff for the work you do. It's not like you do A and you get B back. That doesn't mean, sure, there are jobs you can do as an artist. I've done a lot of those. But the stuff that really matters as an artist, the stuff that really matters that for you to do as an artist is stuff where there may not ever be a financial payoff. And so we have to think a little bit about how we fit into a world where financial payoffs and stuff is so important. And one of the solutions to this problem is to start creating community from scratch, creating artistic communities that normalizes and values the making of art regardless of whether or not it's financially viable. If there is status, maybe it's status that comes from engaging in the practice of making art or in the artistic accomplishments themselves, but it could potentially be divorced from finances and money and stuff. And I think we can see in our history lots of examples of where this might have already happened. The idea of an art collective, going way back to kind of like the Bohemians. Even further back, I think we can look at the history of religion and we can see these little communities that have spun off to really determine their own realities. And one of the forms these have taken is monasteries. So I've actually been really interested in monasteries, the tradition of monasteries. It's something we see across the world, across all cultures. And so I was super interested when I heard an interview with Miles Bukiet on the Emerge podcast about modern monasticism. I read he had a paper he wrote about modern monasticism, and I read it. I was super intrigued, and I think there's a big potential here there for artistic communities. There's maybe a model here that we can look at, and maybe we can adapt, or use to inform the artistic communities that we decide to build. So with that in mind, this is my discussion with Miles Bukiet. I hope that kind of introduction helps to frame why I'm so intrigued by this. And I really hope you enjoy this discussion. How to be an artist. Step 10, Modern Monasticism, with guest Miles Bukiet. Well, Miles, thanks for joining me. This is I'm super interested in talking with a little bit about monasteries of the future and this kind of vision for this new contemplative age, whatever that might look like. So I guess I should explain a little where I'm coming from. So this is actually kind of an art focused podcast, but it is kind of art focused, thinking about what ought the role of an artist to be in the 21st century, and how might we rethink the institutions that need to exist to support that. And especially kind of looking outside of, I think kind of the commercial market driven way of looking at art. So I actually had this, an earlier conversation with a friend of mine where we were literally saying something like, oh, it'd be cool to have an art monastery, a monastery you go to and you just make art, And it was a day after that, I heard your interview on Emerge, talking about monasteries of the future. And I was like, that's it, And, so I read your paper and I thought it was very interesting. This kind of very unique angle, on meditation, but also this thing that can be integrated into society, which I think is super interesting. So I think it actually would be interesting to start with the idea of, you spoke a little bit about standards, this idea of standards within meditation, which I think is super interesting because I personally had the experience of meditating for a long time and being okay, it's kind of having this vague idea of what is possible with meditation, and then discovering kind of more recently that there's much more depth to it than I realized. And it's kind of I was dribbling a basketball thinking that was basketball, and then not realizing that there's Michael Jordan level play possible,
Yeah.
So I'm interested in kind of this idea of standards and why standards is important to contemplative practice.
Yeah, definitely. I'll hop in on that. I also just want to say, I'm very interested in your idea of an art monastery too. So I'm looking forward to talking that through with you.
Maybe we can get to that. Yeah.
But yeah, standards. I think that this is one of the most important and overlooked elements in contemplative training. We have a situation now where practices that were very rare even just a couple decades ago have entered our culture in a big way. And while that's wonderful, I think that what we lack is an understanding, a deep understanding of these practices, and particularly a deep understanding of where they can really go given time. So when there is a lack of standards, what we lose is the possibility of people achieving the deepest layers of the path. So obviously, it's great to play basketball with your buddies and in the hoop out back or down the street, and it's also really good that there's an NBA. And if we cared about having people who are truly great at basketball, it would be critical that kids knew that there was such a thing as the NBA and college basketball and high-level high school teams and all the rest. And so in the contemplative world, yes, it's very important that we know that there are such things as professionals, and that we understand who they are.
Yeah, and you kind of refer to those as contemplative adepts, people that are just Yeah, Michael Jordan's of meditation. Now, how is that important? I'm kind of interested as far as obviously you want these very high standards, or you want to kind of explore how far you can take the practice of meditation. But how does that? Why does that matter for like the lay person that's like, okay, I want to be involved with meditation and I want better well-being in my life, whatever that means. I want to live a more fulfilling life. How does knowing that there's that level you can get to help that person?
It's a really good question. I think it helps that person in a number of ways. Well, one is that the more skilled the teachers are, the more likely that person is to have actually like a good, solid, coherent contemplative education available to them. So one of the problems with the lack of standards is that people can really misunderstand how the path unfolds, and then that trickles down to people even at a beginner level who are receiving, shoddy instructions, or just not really going about things in the most beneficial way. So that's one element of how it matters to that individual.
Yeah, yeah.
Another way it matters too is that we we all live in a culture together, and the more people there are who are going to the deepest layers of the path, that starts to affect how our culture understands basic things like happiness and
Mm.
success and well-being and human potential and many other facets that are deeply important. So, for example, training in ethics and understanding how training in ethics actually leads to a deep kind of happiness, even if you don't go to like some kind of Olympic standard, understanding the trajectory is critical. And the more there are people who have gone to the highest levels, that will trickle, I think, all the way back to, the 5 minutes a day crowd.
Sure. Yeah. How do you feel about kind of the idea too of making people kind of aware of some of the hazards? I don't know if hazards is the right word, but just the fact that it's not all sunshine, when you get into meditation, that there can be some more like heavy stuff that can happen when you start poking around in your mind.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart. And I think disclosure and reasonable expectations are a really good idea.
Good. So yeah, I'm interested in then, I guess, talking about like why that makes something like a monastery important, and kind of your thoughts about the role that monasteries play in kind of facilitating these standards, or creating these meditation adepts.
Yeah, so monastery is a big term, and it covers an incredible range of institutions across many religions. And there are also some things that seem to, be similar across monasteries. So when I was defining monasteries of the future, the parts of monasteries that I highlighted were that they were very rigorous, and they were designed to train certain basic human capacities and virtues to an extremely high level. Um, and then they create structures that people can live in. And these structures, both, physical structures like a house to live in, and other structures like a schedule to follow, or the type of meals
Mm-hmm.
to eat, or various restrictions around behaviors, all the rest that these structures are used to create a high level of training.
So yeah, I'm interested in that whole idea of rigor, like the idea of renunciation. Like I think there's this interesting thing about creating these spaces where obviously they're kind of insulated from the outside world, but also like the rigor and the kind of the things you give up can create like I guess I mean, obviously there's some benefits for the practitioners doing that, but also it creates a reputation for those places, right? That people look at them and there's some sort of like deference to them and some sort of even sacredness for those places. So I think that's kind of interesting as I've been thinking about like making art and fitting art into these places where there's not contempt for it, but rather some sort of like respect for the work being done. I guess one question I would have would be, so there clearly are already institutions that exist, already monasteries that exist that come from other more Orthodox traditions, whether these are, Christian traditions or obviously you have like Hindu traditions and Buddhist, all types of Buddhist monasteries. So like, why not just kind of replicate those things that are already out there? Just make kind of some more of these Orthodox institutions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I'm all for orthodoxy, especially when it works. And we do have, a fair number of monasteries that are still doing things very much the way they've been done for hundreds or even thousands of years. And that's wonderful, and I hope that that continues. And I also know that for myself, um, that never would have worked for me. And, I'm a
Hmm.
modern person. I grew up in New York City in the 1990s, and I have a cell phone in my pocket, and, I read and write and spend a lot of time on the internet and do all these things that modern people do. And for me, I needed something else. I needed something else both in order to spark my interest and to sustain my interest. And I think that one of the defining features of monasteries of the future is that they are designed to meet modern people where they are psychologically, where they are physically, where they are philosophically, and from there, um, create structures for them to engage in deep contemplative practice.
So yeah, I'm interested in that, this idea that we kind of need something that's a fit for our contemporary world, which clearly this has been kind of like an evolutionary process. You look at kind of meditation training as it's entered the West, and there's been kind of this, I guess, sifting through what is of use to to this practice, what stuff is cultural, baggage for lack of a better term, and kind of adapting it for our contemporary situation. And you kind of talk about like, yeah, you use a cell phone, right? You want to be connected to the internet, et cetera, et cetera. But there still is, within the modern vision of a monastery, there still is an extent of the broader world that is filtered out. So what is essential to be filtered out of the outside world in the modern monastery? And what can we kind of bring in with that?
Yeah,
We
wow,
can bring in with us, I guess.
another great question. So so yeah, there is an element of monasteries where you create a training center that's in some ways of the world and in some ways separate from the world. And in truth, this isn't really that different than the way it happens in other fields. Like for example, I have some friends right now who are finishing up medical training. And
Hmm.
if you go into medical school, you will go into a very strange, insular little world for a couple of years'
Sure.
time, and then you will disappear into a hospital for a few more years, and then you might come out and have like a career as a doctor. So so it's actually like this sort of like role of an academy or a seminary or a professional school that's already pretty well understood in our culture. I think the big shift is understanding that this can also happen in the contemplative world, and that contemplative skills
Sure.
um, you know, are, I'd say, every bit as difficult to develop, and it's just as important that the structure is thoughtfully created, and they require an immense amount of personal effort to attain. Um,
And is the I mean, you mentioned before when we were talking before we were recording, you spent some time with the monastic academy, and I think you just did a retreat there. Is that kind of like a template, or I guess a laboratory for building this type of contemporary monastery?
yeah, absolutely. So the Monastic Academy is a training center in northern Vermont, and it's highly inspired by Japanese Zen, but it presents the forms in a way that is available for modern secular people. I think that this place, one of the reasons I love it so much here, and why I'll, drive all the way from New York City, like 7 hours, basically up to Canada, to get to train here, is that it is an example of, I think, hopefully, of what will be many places to come. It's an example of a place that is currently engaged in the challenge of bringing intensive, rigorous contemplative training into a structure that is innovative, in that it's meeting modern people in new and appropriate ways, but at the same time contains a deep rigor and respect for the further reaches of the path.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit about monastic academy, and if I understand it correctly, what's really kind of interesting to me about it is it's also different than, like, I've read about people doing long-term retreats where it's like, I'm going to do a 2-year retreat. And in that case, it sounds like you're meditating just kind of nonstop every day, all day. And if I understand correctly, monastic, that kind of ebbs and flows that you treat, where it is intensive meditation training, but there is also other periods where it's like you're mixing your meditation time with doing other type of work. And I'm not sure exactly what type of work that is, and maybe you can kind of help explain that. But is that accurate? I mean, what is that mix of time like that you spend in a place like that?
Yeah, it's totally accurate. And it's one of the very interesting and actually very
Hmm.
difficult things about living here. I spent a year in full-time training here, and I finished that up a couple of years ago, and now it's just come periodically, either to train myself or to help out in some capacity. And yeah, there's this constant oscillation here. They're looking to train two things primarily. One they
Hmm.
call awakening, which refers to basic contemplative skills like deep attentional training, samadhi, the breaking of self view, classical enlightenment. So
Mm-hmm.
that's awakening. And then they also look to train what they call responsibility, which is being helpful
Yeah.
and showing up for other people and for this world. So examples of responsibility would be basically any NGO you've ever heard of, and you know. So obviously there's NGOs that are very deeply engaged in responsibility as well. Potentially companies or other organizations too. Um, and many organizations devoted sort of exclusively to that awakening side of things. And at the Monastic Academy, they try to train both of them in tandem. So what that means is on a day-to-day level, they wake up and they meditate for a few hours, and during that time, people are single-pointedly focused on their contemplative training, on developing attention, on settling the mind, on actually releasing thinking and developing peacefulness. And then, after breakfast, they launch into responsibility. It takes on many forms here, but A lot of it is around actually just running this place and keeping it going and making sure the guests are cared for. But then also a lot of other sorts of tasks like the marketing for this place or telling the story of it, the fundraising that keeps it alive, and so in that people get trained in basic sorts of nonprofit skills, nonprofit development. So here they oscillate like that on a day-to-day basis, about maybe 4 hours of meditation a day, or so, and then many hours. I forget the exact numbers, and they're kind of
Hmm.
tinkering with their schedule all the time. So something like then 4 to 6 hours of work, and then on a monthly level, they're oscillating as well. So once a month, there's an awakening week, and during that week, all the computers get turned off and the vacation responders go up, and people just dive in and engage single-pointedly in contemplative practice. And then that week ends, and again back to the daily oscillation. And then even on a bigger time frame, once someone has lived here for a while, maybe some people end up here for many years, then they might get the opportunity to go in and do a retreat in one of the cabins on the land, and that might be three
And is
months.
that the type of thing? Sorry, I just asked really quickly. So that is that the type of thing where they're kind of retreating in a solitary way, but then they can still have access to a teacher as they're doing that process?
Exactly. So they'll be
Okay.
off in a little cabin, on their own schedule, eating, 2 meals a day, just that get delivered to them. But then they can join for what are called interviews, where they sit down and they meet one on one with their teacher and talk specifically about practice. So it's an extremely conducive
Hmm.
environment for really getting to some of the depth that this practice has to offer. But one of the things that's really remarkable about this tandem training is I think it keeps people honest and grounded in
Hmm.
a remarkable way, that it's actually very hard to go back and forth between
Yeah.
those two things.
You mentioned that was challenging. I was going to ask kind of why that is. Yeah.
It's really hard because they seem to be running counter to each other so much of the
Hmm.
time. So much of the time, it really seems as though to let go and do the contemplative thing would be to destroy your ability to serve. And so much of the time, it seems that in serving, you have to lose ground and peace and
Wow.
all these other skills that are being
That's very
cultivated.
interesting.
So you get just strung in the middle of this incredible challenge living here, and that makes it, I lived here for a year. It was one of the most difficult years of my life because of the way
Huh.
that those were constantly pulling each other back and forth, and yeah, and I think that what that does though is for the people who stick out, who stick with this training for a while, it creates a level of competency and trustworthiness that's really remarkable.
Interesting. Yeah, I know you mentioned you're talking about the things that are developed doing like contemplative training, and the one that's kind of surprised me was you mentioned grit. I don't know if that partially covers that grit part that you have to learn to kind of move between these two different modes, or if that's more of a general thing. But yeah, I'm really fascinated by that because I have read a lot of stuff talking about how like people that really, when you really jump deep into meditation and you're doing that all the time, you start seeing reality from that very particular perspective, right? And it can reveal some very useful things, obviously. But that kind of integration of coming back into the real world can be pretty jarring a lot of times,
Oh
And that
yeah.
seems like that's kind of a constant problem, is kind of figuring out like how do we gain these benefits from this practice without having to be loopy, hermits totally disconnected from reality.
Yeah, that's so well said. How do we gain these benefits without being loopy hermits? And that's a real challenge, and that's again one of the reasons why I love the monastic academy, and actually why when I found out about it, I really moved a lot around in my life to make it possible for myself to train here, because both of these things are deeply important to me. And actually, during some of the extended solitary retreat I did, like the things that were the hardest for me to stop thinking about and planning were, how am I actually going to be of benefit in this world one day? And everybody's different, and certainly the world needs doesn't need everyone to engage deep contemplative practice. And also for the people who engage contemplative practice, some of them should just be loopy hermits. We really need that.
We can benefit from some of those, yeah.
We could benefit from some loopy hermits. They have their place, and many cultures have given them a place, often a quite revered one. Um, but for myself, I spent the first 20 some odd years of my life like learning how to read and learning how to write and learning how to think, and I see that my position in the world and the way my mind works at this point, I don't think I could ever feel happy and as though I was leading a meaningful life if I wasn't engaged in some tangible way and working to make this world a better place. So
Yeah.
for me, I need both.
Yeah, that's one thing that's really struck me. I mean, I've mentioned in email before that I've kind of had a little bit of a fast introduction to, or recent introduction to, kind of how deep contemplative practice can get, and I'm starting to kind of learn more about it, and it's so fascinating and it's so interesting, and it's pretty fun, and in a lot of different ways too. And in some ways, it's like, wow, this answers so many things. This makes so many things make sense. But then there is this whole other element outside of it that's still like, okay, how about how we interact with one another, and how about how we live as community, and how we live as a society, and obviously these existential problems of like, how do we prevent ourselves from like destroying ourselves,
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
it's kind of interesting that, like, yeah, contemplative practice can definitely answer some of those questions, but like it doesn't answer all those questions, And
Yes.
so this idea of how you integrate that with living a good life and contributing to society, and I think all that stuff is really, really interesting. I think one thing I'm kind of interested in talking about, and I guess I should kind of disclose a little bit. One of my interests in kind of monastic stuff, it goes back like pretty far. So I grew up LDS Mormon, and I was like a missionary for 2 years, and I like totally loved that experience. Even though actually it was really difficult experience, but I also really liked it, and I liked that it was this kind of like monastic experience. That for 2 years you're being like a temporary monk. For like a Mormon missionary, you're not dating, you're totally disconnected from, any type of media, no music, no television. You're wearing this like uniform. It's not robes, but it basically could be robes, because it's as like different from what everyone else is wearing as robes could be, and that was something that really appealed to me. And so I'm no longer Mormon, but that period, I still think a lot about the speculation of what could that be. Like in some ways, there's something there. There's something there as far as being able to leave life for a period of time and being able to learn something, I guess, particular to being a good person, and then like coming back into life, and like, what do you bring back with you? And so I thought it was really interesting towards the end of your paper, you're talking about also how this is something similar with like young Thai men, that they may enter a monastery. It's kind of almost even expected. If they want to get married, they got to enter a monastery for a little while and get that experience. So I guess the question is like, there's this question like, okay, is meditation for everyone? Is contemplative practice for everyone? I mean, is there some sort of like minimum standard the same way we kind of expect a certain amount of a standard of education or literacy, is there some sort of minimum standard of contemplative fitness that we might expect from, like, maybe hope for I guess the rank and file in the world?
Yeah, I certainly hope for that. I also I love, just as an aside, I love getting to hear a little bit about your history. And the Mormons, they do an awful lot right. They didn't put $50 billion in the bank for no reason, and they consistently rank as some of the happiest
Oh
people
yeah.
in at least in the country, if not in the world. And um, yeah, and then to your question, I think it would really behoove our culture to look very closely at that and ask, yes, like, what are the standards that are important for people to reach? We already know that, people need to know how to read and write and do basic mathematics and put their pants on and all the other things that we pretty much all learn how to do because that's part of what living in this culture means. And
Hmm.
what if living in this culture also meant other things, like the ability to handle a powerful emotion, or the
Hmm.
ability to find peace and joy in an object as simple as the breath, so we don't destroy our entire planet seeking a happiness that we can't find from things?
Yeah.
Or how to cultivate and grow a universal love that connects us to all living things. So these are not simply abstract. They're actually all trainable skills. And when we don't train them, we have certain consequences. And when we do train them, we have certain consequences. Already at a very uh, small level, but very significantly, we started to see education is starting to take these things seriously, um, with the growth of social emotional learning and the use
Hmm.
of the introduction of social emotional learning to schools, elementary schools, high schools, etc. And that's wonderful, and starts to offer like a very basic sort of training. And yeah, my sense is that we would want our culture to be built on people understanding these things, and especially when we look at some of the larger level cultural challenges and even existential sorts of risks like climate change. I think these are partly founded on a culture that has no real respect for wisdom, and for
Yeah.
compassion.
Yeah.
So yeah, would it behoove us to train those things? Absolutely. And then figuring out what the proper kind of dose is, what should everyone
Yeah.
receive, what should some people receive, what should just be available to, the few who choose to go deeply. That's a nuanced kind of process to
That's
figure
a
out.
very, very interesting question. Yeah. I think I mentioned that a little bit in a previous email. Like, what's the minimum effective dose to get people some wisdom,
Yep.
and obviously that changes from person to person. Some people can progress very quickly, and other people it takes a long, long time, So,
Yeah,
um,
just to borrow something too from the kind of way of thinking here at the Monastic Academy too, I think it's particularly important. Wisdom is particularly important for people with power.
oh
And
yeah,
we have a culture that obviously does not uh, link the two, or particularly think that there should be a link. And the
yeah.
results are disastrous. So instead, I dream of a world where people have power proportionate to their wisdom.
Yeah, I think this kind of relates to a point you're making at the end of your interview on Emerge when you're talking about like social mobility, like this idea of, and this is almost, I'm kind of getting really tangential here, but this does relate, but this idea that what are the things that we value? What type of things do we bestow honor upon in our society? You know, and obviously there's a cultural tradition that goes back all human history, but it's very strong now, that it's like people that are wealthy or obviously have power in other ways, we bestow honor on them, and those are the people we want to lead. But there is also a tradition, a very strong tradition, of also bestowing honor on people that are willing to, you know, do these kind of contemplative, make these contemplative choices or sacrifice to a high degree. You know, people that choose the spiritual path and can demonstrate their willingness to sacrifice everything for that. You know, at least we have in the case of Tibet anciently, that they actually were able to make that move to say like, oh, our highest honors go to people walking kind of the spiritual path, the path of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Tibet.
Sorry, I'm not sure where I was going with that.
Well, I could just riff a little, like, you know, whether it's Tibet or Thailand or India. I think that, yes, there was a monetary sort of patronage of monastics, and that was part of what allowed these orders to exist and to prosper. But there was also this cultural piece of there being a certain understanding for and respect for a path of contemplative training as something meaningful and something that helps the whole culture to work. So now we live in a culture where that doesn't exist. We have a worship of other things, of, you know, you mentioned money or certain types of prestige or intelligence or this or that. And so carving out a new kind of niche and both making the case for why it's important to have contemplative adepts, and then starting to create the culture that admires them and supports them and works to make sure that they can do what they do.
Yeah. I can't remember who said it, but someone said something like this, kind of getting back to the point you're making before, that like we're gods, but for the wisdom, you know. And obviously this is some point a lot of people would make have made is we've made all these advances technologically, and just we haven't quite caught up with kind of the wisdom to use it well. You know, and it's yet to be seen whether we figure that out. But it seems like it really, one of the issues is this kind of educational component. Like that it's within our education where we are establishing those values, and we're kind of establishing how we bestow honors on people. And I think of how common of a comment I've heard, even for like higher education, hearing people out of higher education, the expectation with higher education is primarily it is meant to prepare you to get a job, and how that plays such a large part in how we identify ourselves and how we value ourselves. It's like, oh, I'm making money, I'm a good person. And then obviously it affects who we want to choose to be our leaders. And kind of going back to Mormonism, one of the things I think Mormonism does do well is I think they are good at teaching morality. And I've wondered why that is. Like, I do see my Mormon peers, I see the way that I was raised, and it's just like Mormons take that stuff very seriously. It's like being honest, having integrity, being a good person. And it's not that other people don't, but there's something particular about the way that Mormons teach that it works really well, you know? And I think part of what it is that Mormons, even though they care about making money just like everyone else, that their identity as being Mormon is very high. If you're going to kind of stack identities, that's kind of the top of the list, right? They identify first as Mormon, and then other things come later. And so those moral things kind of have greater weight. So this idea of creating, you know, normalizing morality and spirituality and wisdom as being things that we can prioritize even higher than sort of making money seems like a good way to kind of move forward on keeping ourselves from blowing us ourselves up, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, literally, like it's a question that I think can seem sort of airy-fairy or tangential or unimportant compared to maybe the need for strong borders and good military and plenty of food until the whole system cracks in half and we realize like wow we cannot stop global climate change with the minds that are running this world now. Like we can't see from the perspective that we need to see from in order to beat that. Or even with the coronavirus, you look at the countries that actually did the best in containing it, and they had some of the most empathic leaders, the ones who
Mm.
actually cared about people. And now we have incredibly negative consequences, obviously, for health and well-being, but also for the economy. So it's kind of I think, an ultimately crazed point of view that we just don't need to worry about morality and
Yeah.
we'll be fine.
Yeah, it seems pretty critical.
Yeah, and critical too for well-being, like I got to
Yeah.
dig a bit into some of the modern research on positive psychology a couple of years ago, and you look at what makes people happy, and yeah, it's like making money up to 70 to $90,000 a
Yeah.
year contributes quite significantly to your happiness, and then lo and behold, there's other things that you know, really matter, like relationships and exercise and mindfulness and all these other elements to a meaningful life. And then, yes, like ethics and community are also um, critical. And this might be why we do see higher levels of subjective well-being, generally speaking, within religious populations, is because they have understood a thing or two about priorities and values.
Yeah, and it's kind of going to be interesting to see like this next step we take. And I mean, whether you want to call it religion or whatever it is, what institutionally is going to be there to be able to normalize morality so that we can all kind of be on the same page and value it and make sure that becomes a priority in our well-being.
Yeah, we're really risking throwing out the baby with the bathwater here
Yeah.
if we don't find a really good answer to that question of what do we uh, how do we move forward um, religiously? How do we move forward ethically and morally? And I think scientific materialism is only going to ever take us so far. So there still really is a role for other sorts of organizations and institutions in order to carry forward an ethical training, but an ethical training that's appropriate for modern people.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an interesting, I guess, place to go from there is, how do we go about now, um, like making this happen? Like, how do we go about like populating the world with, with monasteries and getting that up and running, and seeing those benefits?
Yeah, that's a question I sort of wake up with every day and ask myself, how can I help make this real? So it's not just ideas in my head or some cute conversation with a friend here and there. And
Mm-hmm.
there's already a few organizations that I think are doing it where they, here, but we just keep talking a lot about the monastic academy. There's other places too, but this one is, I think, particularly good. And I happen to be sitting here right now. Um, so yeah, they work to make this real every day, and that means fundraising, and that means making sure the place is swept and the beans are cooked, and it means working through the structures and figuring out what's working and what's not, and it means dealing with all sorts of community issues that are vexing and challenging and painful. And that's what they wake up and do here. And so it's incredibly important that people keep coming to places like this and, devoting
Yeah.
themselves to the training. And it's important too that people support the training in Asia, for example, where, they have a long Buddhist monastic traditions there. It's always been this relationship between the monastics and the laity, and the lay people providing the rice and
Mm-hmm.
the money and the sustenance for the monks, and then the monks doing the training. So developing that relationship here, figuring out what is this relationship between monastics and laity in a modern context.
Yeah. And is there some sort of, I mean, I know there's like sponsorship. I'm sure there's looking for sponsors and donations and things like that. What sort of relationship does a monastic academy have like in the community? Is it kind of adjacent to a nearby community? Is there any sort of relationship there?
Yeah, so it's one of the most remote places
Okay.
in the Northeast. Like,
Which is a common in the culture of monasteries, right?
yeah, they often are at somewhat of a remove, although often at a little bit less of a remove than the monastic academy is out here.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
you get in the car and you drive for 30 minutes, and then you're in like the town of Lowell, which I
Okay.
don't know, I think a couple hundred people, if I had to guess the population. Um,
Yeah.
so they do have a strong relationship with a community in Burlington, and
Hmm.
then now through the internet and through media, they have a relationship with people all over the world. So there is a kind of delocalization that's possible given modern technology. Um, but yeah, hammering out over time, like what does that look like, and what should that look like is another question to address.
And then also, if people like wanted to participate in something like the monastic academy, like what does that look like? What is that process like?
So there's many ways people come here. For example, they come as guests, and they'll spend, maybe they'll come to a week-long retreat, or maybe they'll just come and do their own work here while also participating in some of the forms and the schedule, and start to sniff out the community and see if it might be a good fit. So whether they start kind of by, stepping their toes in the water, or some people will jump right in they do these 2 to 3 month long apprenticeship programs where people will
Hmm.
come and live here actually for free, and train and work and
Yeah.
be a part of the schedule. And in that amount of time, I think people often, get a really good sense of if doing more is a good thing for them or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sorry, I feel like I'm just peppering you with all these like uh, tough questions, but I'm also interested in like there's a couple of things I'm interested. I'm interested in like sustainability, like keeping these organizations running. Um, you have like you look at like Thai forest monks, and their overhead's very low, right? Because they have like barely any possessions, and they go beg for food, and it's like how much money does it really keep to like take to keep the lights on in a place like that, right? So there's obviously the spiritual benefits that come from that, but there's also the sustainability of keeping that institution going just because it's kind of not a lot of overhead for it. So I'm kind of interested in that. But I'm also interested in like accessibility. So like you talk about the apprenticeship is something that's free. Like what else is monastic academy doing, or what else potentially could institutions like this be doing to make sure that it's accessible to the broadest kind of selection of people possible?
Yeah, so accessibility is a critical issue, and in a culture with such growing inequity, one that absolutely needs to be addressed. So there's, I mean, a million ways to implement it. I listed one, which was, making this apprenticeship program free.
Yeah.
Um, and this is where too, the laity comes in, And once we understand how important it is that people get to go through contemplative training, both as like a basic issue of justice, that
Mm-hmm.
like people who want to do that should be allowed to do that, irregardless of financial means, but then also as an issue of these people will end up benefiting our culture in ways that are very easy to see and in ways that are very difficult to see. Um, so that's part of, I think, the case that then gets made to the lay supporters, which is by you donating, you make this education possible. And
Mm-hmm.
and then we exist, within the constraints of a market-based economy. And so we absolutely need money in order to make things happen and pay for food and electricity
Mm-hmm.
and the mortgage and all the rest of the myriad things that we pay for. But if you look on a dollar for dollar basis at this training, so I think that it's been a little while since I've been in the real weeds of the finances of the monastic academy, but I think it was in the order of a couple $100,000 a year to keep this place running. Um,
Wow.
and you're training like 20 plus people full time, and then in addition to that, there's all the guests who will come and have, a lot of them. It's not uncommon for somebody to come for one of the week-long retreats each month and leave saying that that was
Hmm.
the most significant experience of their life, and for them
Sure.
to mean it, and then for it to continue to bear fruits in terms of how they're orienting towards the world and how they're living and all the rest. So then you're talking $10,000 per person per year, if you're only including the benefit for the people who are living here and training here full time. Now, you compare that to, like, let's say, a liberal arts education, which might be
Absolutely.
topping in at,
Yeah.
over $50,000 a year or something. Um, it's actually, and that's an education that's just training people to get a job. We're talking about an
Sometimes not
education,
even doing that.
right? Often it's a
Yeah,
rude
very often.
awakening. But I look, for example, at my friend. I have this friend. His name is Peter, and he lives here. And I met him about 4 years ago when he was 1 year into his training, and he's been here that whole time. So he's about 5 years in now. Um,
Wow.
and he has gone from someone who was very kind and interested in practice and smart and curious to one of the people who contemplatively I most respect in this world.
Hmm.
And that was only 5 years. It's
Wow.
easy for me to forget how brief that is. Like, it took me almost that long to get through college, and I'm really not quite sure what I learned, although it was fun. And
Yeah.
so in that respect, like, realizing that, man, if we just invest in someone for 5 years, then they can come out like Peter. That's amazing. And then, I look at people who I think are holding some of the highest standards in the world for contemplative training, and that'll probably take you, I don't know, maybe 10 plus years, somewhere like that. But even that's not so
Mm-hmm.
very long. For $100,000, we could have an absolutely world class contemplative. Think of what the U.S. military spent in the last minute on new
Yeah.
hardware. So yeah, I think that I do actually get excited about the finances of it, and I break down in my capstone too some other interesting kinds of ways to look at and consider money. I think it costs, I gosh, just another number I forget, in the ballpark of something like $50,000 a year to incarcerate someone in this country, and we have
Oh,
one
sure.
of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and actually we have terrible rates of recidivism too. So even
People
just
come out
from
worse.
they come out worse and they go back to jail, or prison.
Yeah.
So uh, yeah, if we were actually interested in training people to be really wonderful members of society. I think we could do that instead of just ruining their lives, and that even economically, it actually might make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mentioned in a previous email, you talk about like, incarceration. Have you looked very much at like the model of like Delancey Street or like Other Side Academy? You familiar with those
No,
much?
but I should definitely Google both of them.
I'm super fascinated by them for the same reason, because it's for kind of people that have hit the bottom. So it's like people with drug problems, people coming out of jail, things like that. There's no cost to participate. So like the process is kind of interesting. Like you show up there and you just sit on a bench, and that just signals you're interested in being involved. They'll come out and interview you. It's run totally by former alumni. So there aren't like a bunch of, credentialed staff, running all of it. It's a bunch of like former inmates and drug addicts. They have like this commitment. There's like a couple year commitment, and then it's all funded by these like businesses they run. And
Wow.
like they have this moving company. And so there's one in Salt Lake City, and they have a moving company, and they're like the highest rated moving company in Salt Lake City. And, we had them move us, our last move they did. And it was like from the time they started till they were done, it was like, 2 hours. And so it was well done. Nothing got broken, but what really impressed me is there's just this like sense of like camaraderie and like pride they're taking in doing their work. And because, what they're doing is they're funding they're paying for themselves to do this process, to be in this institution they're in and this program that they're in. But there's something that I kind of envied about it. Like looking at that, I'm like, that's kind of cool. They're taking pride in their work, and it's not just like I'm getting paid, so I gotta do this, Um,
That's
but I thought that
amazing.
overlap was kind of interesting. Yeah.
So inspiring and hopeful, and um and isn't that so interesting that you'd be, sitting there, someone else is like moving all your furniture, and like the envy is going towards them, and that's actually probably intelligent, because you see that there's a sense of purpose and commitment and life about what's going on.
Yeah.
So that just sounds like a wonderful organization.
Yeah, pretty interesting. It'd be very interesting to see what type of overlap there could be. I mean, most of the time they spend is they do their work, they do some schooling, and then they have like these group sessions where they kind of work through issues just as a group. But it'd be interesting to see, if some sort of contemplative practice could play a role in
Oh,
something like that. But
absolutely. And the way I would see, let's say, for example, monasteries in the future interfacing with, you called it Delancey Street. Was that the name of the organization?
yeah, Delancey Street is one of the big ones. The other one is Other Side Academy. That's the one that's in Salt Lake City where I'm
Yeah,
where
so
I'm at.
Delancey Street and Other Side Academy is, let's say you have places like the Monastic Academy that are
Mm,
effectively minting contemplative adepts, right? You put in the raw material,
yeah,
a curious, interested,
yeah,
committed person, and then 5 years later, you get out like someone who you look at and you're like, whoa, damn. And then 10 or 15,
yeah,
20 years later, you get out someone who's really mastered the path largely. And then, these people all go on to serve in all the different ways that they serve in the different communities where maybe they have the most leverage or the most ability to be impactful, or where they get called or invited or whatever it is. And then, yeah, I could see, let's say, one of these adepts either partnering with an organization that already exists, like Other Side Academy, or creating
hmm
an equivalent sort of program that also then has a deep contemplative component as well.
yeah, yeah. That could be very interesting. And I get very excited about the whole sustainability issue.
Uh-huh.
Like the numbers are cool because when you see the numbers, I don't know if you ever get to like play with spreadsheets at all, but it's like as an artist, like I was talking with a friend about this the other day, and it's like, oh, I never would have thought I would have been into spreadsheets, but it's really cool. And you can look at a spreadsheet that like shows you, hey, this thing is possible. We can make this crazy idea work, because if it's sustainable, then it's possible. You can make some sort of dream a reality. But yeah, so okay, we spent a bunch of time talking about this. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about maybe how art could be folded into something like this. And you do mention this briefly in your capstone. So maybe I can just get your thoughts on it, and then maybe I don't know, I can respond to that or whatever.
Yeah, great. So I think that there's two initial things that come to mind for how art and contemplative practice go hand in hand, or can support each other. One is the um, let's just start with the effectiveness side. So I think that the more someone trains, let's say the ability to pay attention, they operate at a higher level. So
Mm,
anything they do is going to go better. Once you can pay attention to your breath, lo and behold, it actually also translates into paying attention to other things like writing
yeah.
emails or holding your brush and considering what color to use and what angle to place the object at, whatever it is. So higher attention is just going to lead to better outcomes, and this is akin to basically having a faster computer, for example. It just becomes better at what it does, and
Mm-hmm.
so artists, like people in any developed field, I think could really become more skilled and from contemplative training. And then there's another piece, and this one's really important, which is the motivational side of things. So, as you sort of alluded to at the beginning, so much of art now is just in the grips of a capitalist machine that seems
Yeah.
hell bent on destroying life on Earth, amongst other things.
Mm-hmm.
And like I went to a school a college that attracted a pretty artsy crowd, and there were a lot of very skilled artists there, and most of them went on to go into um, film, particularly like the types of films that make money. So just
Mm-hmm.
entertainment, um, and a whole lot of other people went into advertising. And you look at the role that entertainment and advertising play in this culture, and entertainment is a little more nuanced. I think it has some genuine value, although a lot of what it
Yeah.
serves to do is simply distract people from what's most important in this life. And advertising, which actively works to hijack people's minds and convince them to do things that are neither in their own interest nor the general interest. And so much of the power of art has been co-opted, and yeah, if artists could engage in a contemplative training that prioritized ethics, and then we might see the power of art yoked to certain beautiful
Yeah.
causes, like for example raising environmental awareness or shifting uh, shifting the tide on racism or any of a million things, that that would be very significant. Um, so yeah, I could see for sure there being a sort of contemplative art sort of art monastery place, which was in the same way the monastic academy really trains in awakening and responsibility. I think for artists, and you know more about this than I, being an artist,
Hmm.
that uh, your art itself can be your responsibility to the world. It can be
Yeah.
your gift and your vow, and so there should be art
Yeah.
monasteries. I bet they'd create amazing artists too. The amount of
Yeah. I
creativity
mean,
also that comes from a quiet mind is like way
yeah.
more than what comes from a busy, noisy mind.
Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, what you say about kind of how art gets kind of captured by capitalism. This is the problem that every young artist faces. I mean, when I have parents come and talk to me about, oh, my child wants to be an artist, the first concern is, how are they going to make money? And that's kind of the nature of art, is there's not this one-to-one like there is with other work you do, where it's like, oh, I put in a couple hours, I get so much money. It's like art doesn't always pay the bill so easily,
I just had a really good idea with that.
Yeah.
Okay. So monasteries of the future already, what they do is they get lay patronage so that people can spend their lives devoted to inner cultivation and outer service. So what if you simply had an art monastery where people were supported in deeply pursuing contemplative practice while deeply pursuing art, and then it gave the artists the protection and the space necessary to do their work, and there was also an assurance that it would be of benefit to the world because they're getting so deeply trained in ethics, and then you created a kind of protected space where art could be yoked to what actually matters to people.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool vision.
Yeah,
I feel like
you got to build one.
Hour.
I'll put you in touch with with the director here, and you can see what you can whip up.
No, I'm on it. Honestly, this is something I think seriously a lot about. Just this idea that a young kid could say, like, here's what I want to do, and have their parents be like, oh yeah, like that would bring honor upon our family if you were to be part of this thing and create some sort of sacred, piece of work.
Oh my God, right? Imagine that.
Yeah.
If you could bring honor to your family by engaging art and contemplative practice. And of course, that should bring honor to your family, if you can go very deeply into yourself and into finding love, and then you can be skillful enough to express that in a way that reaches out and touches other people and transforms the way they understand their lives and their values and all the rest. That's that's one of the most important things anyone could possibly do.
Yeah. Well, cool. That gets me really excited for potential of what we could do with art and with, obviously our next generation coming up. So, Miles, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Like I said, I feel like we could have gone. I almost feel like it was just getting started talking about about the art stuff. So maybe we'll have to continue the conversation at another time.
Yeah, it's so fun talking to you, Brandon, and hearing the way you think, and it's really important that you're out there doing what you do. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Miles.
You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.